Beijing, late 1994. The air is biting, the kind of dry, heavy cold that sinks into your bones and stays there. In the heart of the city lies Tsinghua University, an institution that stands as a temple of intellect, the ultimate proving ground for the nation's brightest minds. To get into Tsinghua is to be anointed, to graduate is to be guaranteed a seat among the elite. Among the thousands of students roaming its sprawling campus, 21-year-old Zhu Ling was a star that burned brighter than most. She was a physical chemistry major, a standout swimmer, and a virtuoso on the guqian, a traditional 7-stringed zither. To those who knew her, Ling was the triple threat, a rare blend of traditional grace, athletic prowess, and modern academic ferocity. But in the winter of 1994 that light began to flicker, dimmed by a shadow no one could see and a pain no one could name. It started on November 24th. It was a subtle, creeping discomfort, a loss of appetite, a nagging ache in her abdomen. At first, it seemed like the standard toll of a high-pressure environment. Final exams were looming, the orchestra was rehearsing, and the weight of expectation at Tsinghua was enough to crush anyone. But Ling's body was signaling something far more sinister than stress. Within days, the ache became an agonizing fire. She described it as if her insides were being scraped by shards of glass. Then came the hair. It didn't just thin, it fell out in clumps, leaving her pillowcase covered in long, black strands, every morning a silent, visceral countdown of her own vitality. Despite the escalating agony, Zhu Ling was a creature of immense discipline. On December 11th, she stepped onto the stage of the Beijing Concert Hall for a major performance. She wore a traditional silk dress, her face pale, her frame noticeably thinner. Behind her eyes, a storm was brewing, intermittent vision loss and a searing pain that felt like hot needles being driven into her retinas. Yet she played. The notes of Guanglingsan, an ancient piece known for its haunting complexity, filled the hall. It was a masterpiece of endurance. No one in that audience knew they were watching a woman being systematically dismantled from the inside out. They didn't know that every breath she took was a victory over a molecular assassin already deep in her marrow. The medical community in Beijing was baffled. Initial visits to the infirmary and local hospitals yielded nothing but shrugs and generic prescriptions. They looked for common ailments, perhaps a severe flu or an atypical autoimmune reaction. They eventually settled on a diagnosis of Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare nervous system disorder. But as the new year turned and Ling's condition fluctuated between brief recoveries and violent relapses, a darker reality began to take shape. This wasn't a malfunction of nature. It was a masterpiece of chemistry. In the world of toxicology there is a substance known as the poisoner's poison. It is thallium. It is a heavy metal, tasteless, odorless, and colorless when dissolved. It is a ghost. Thallium mimics potassium, slipping past the body's cellular gates like a Trojan horse. Once inside, it wreaks havoc on the nervous system, the organs, and the very DNA of the victim. It is a patient killer, one that requires precision, access, and a chilling lack of empathy. As Ling lay in her hospital bed in early 1995, her body failing and her mind trapped in a cage of pain, the silent witnesses to her slow execution were her own hair and nails, which were even then absorbing the metallic signature of a killer. But who would want to erase a girl like Zhu Ling? In the sterile, hyper-competitive dormitories of Tsinghua, where every grade was a battle and every accolade a target, the line between admiration and resentment was razor thin. While doctors looked for a cure, a perpetrator was watching the clock, waiting for the evidence to dissolve. And as the investigation would eventually reveal, the most dangerous person in the room is often the one who knows exactly how much it takes to kill you. What the police would soon find was that the poison wasn't just in her system, it was in her dorm room. November 24, 1994, should have been just another Thursday in the high-pressure corridors of Tsinghua University. But for Zhu Ling, it was the day the world began to tilt. It started with a phantom pain, a dull ache in her abdomen that most 20-year-olds would dismiss as a bad cafeteria meal or the stress of impending finals. But by the time December 5th rolled around, the discomfort had graduated into a full-scale assault on her body. The most striking symptom wasn't the pain, but the shedding. Her long jet black hair, a hallmark of her grace, began to fall out in thick, horrifying clumps. Within days, she was nearly bald. A physical transformation that felt less like a medical crisis and more like a slow-motion erasure of her identity. Yet, Zhu Ling was a woman forged in the fires of discipline. Despite the excruciating pain radiating through her joints and the growing fog in her vision, she refused to yield. On December 11, 1994, she stood, or rather, forced herself to sit on the stage of the Beijing Concert Hall. She was there to perform a solo on the guqin, a traditional 7-stringed instrument known for its ethereal, haunting melodies. Those in the audience described the performance as transcendental. They saw a young woman in her prime, pouring her soul into the music. What they didn't see was the sheer, terrifying willpower it took for her to move her fingers. To Zhu Ling, every pluck of the string felt like a needle being driven into her marrow. Her eyes were failing her, the stage lights blurring into a dizzying kaleidoscope of white heat, but she played on. It was a victory of the spirit over a body that was being systematically dismantled from the inside out. By December 23, the victory was short-lived. Zhu Ling was admitted to Beijing Tongren Hospital, her body a battlefield of unexplained symptoms. The doctors were baffled. They looked for tumors, for rare infections, for the fingerprints of known neurological disorders. Slowly, away from the toxic environment of the university, her condition began to stabilize. By late January she was discharged. It seemed the storm had passed, but the mystery of what had leveled a healthy, athletic young woman remained unsolved. The silent witness was her own biology, but in 1995, the technology to read that testimony was still in its infancy in China. What no one realized, not her doctors, not her frantic parents, was that the perpetrator was playing a long game. The period of recovery wasn't a miracle, it was a reprieve. On February 27, 1995, shortly after returning to the campus she loved, the symptoms returned with a vengeance that made the first bout look like a warning shot. This time the pain wasn't just in her stomach, it was in her legs, a searing, electric agony that made even the touch of a bedsheet feel like a blowtorch against her skin. She was dizzy, her speech was slurring, and the vibrant girl who had commanded the concert hall just months prior was now slipping into a twilight zone of neurological decay. By March 20th, Zhu Ling fell into a coma, a deep, dark silence that would last for 5 months. As she lay tethered to machines in the intensive care unit, the laboratory of malice back at Tsinghua was being scrubbed clean. Investigators would later realize that the window of opportunity was closing. While the medical team fought a ghost, the poisoner was focused on the physical evidence. When friends eventually went to retrieve Zhu Ling's belongings from her dorm room, room 223, they noticed something chilling. Amidst the textbooks and music scores, certain mundane items were missing. Her favorite stainless steel cup, her contact lens case, her bottle of shampoo. It was a selective, surgical theft. The perpetrator wasn't looking for valuables. They were looking for the vessels that held the secret of her destruction. They knew that as long as those items existed, they were a heartbeat away from the gallows. And as the police began to look closer at the dorm's occupants, they realized the most terrifying truth of all. The person who knew exactly how much thallium it took to destroy a life was the only one who didn't have to break in to get it. Of shampoo. It was a selective, surgical theft. The perpetrator wasn't looking for valuables, they were looking for the vessels that held the secret of her destruction. They knew that as long as those items existed, they were a heartbeat away from the gallows. And as the police began to look closer at the dorm's occupants, they realized the most terrifying truth of all. The person who knew exactly how much thallium it took to destroy a life was the only one who didn't have to break in to get it. To understand the calculated cruelty of this crime, we have to look at the timeline of Zhu Ling's slow-motion execution. It began on November 24, 1994. It wasn't a sudden collapse, it was a whisper of discomfort. Sharp, localized pains in her abdomen, a sudden, inexplicable loss of appetite. At 21, in the prime of her life, Zhu Ling thought she was just overworked. Tsinghua was a pressure cooker after all. But the fire in her gut wouldn't die down. By December 5, the horror took a more visible form. Every time she brushed her hair, it came away in clumps. Within days, her scalp was bare. The cascading black hair that defined her elegance was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that terrified her family. Yet, Zhu Ling was a fighter. On December 11, despite a body that was rapidly betraying her, she stepped onto the stage for a solo performance of Guanglingson on the guqin. Imagine the scene: the auditorium is hushed, the air is cold, and there stands Zhu Ling, ghostly pale, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity. She was suffering from severe eye pain and her vision was flickering like a dying light bulb. Every pluck of the string must have felt like a needle through her nerves. But she played. She played with a haunting precision that left the audience breathless. It was a victory of the spirit over a body being dissolved from the inside out. It would be her final performance. On December 23, she was admitted to Beijing Tongren Hospital. The doctors were looking for a shadow they couldn't name. They ran tests for everything from rare viruses to autoimmune disorders. And then, something strange happened. Away from the dorms, away from her daily routine, Zhu Ling began to improve. By late January, she was eating again. Her hair began to grow back as a soft fuzz. The toxin was clearing her system because the source was no longer feeding her. To her parents it was a miracle. To her friends it was a recovery. But to the predator watching from the sidelines it was a failure. When the new semester began in February 1995, Zhu Ling was determined to return to her studies. Her parents pleaded with her to stay home, but the pull of her intellect and her community was too strong. On February 27th, she walked back through those university gates. She thought she was returning to her future. In reality, she was walking back into the jaws of a trap. Within days of her return, the nightmare didn't just resume, it accelerated. This wasn't the slow burn of November. This was an assault. The leg pain returned, but this time it was a lightning strike sensation, a deep, bone-crushing agony that made walking an act of torture. Dizziness clouded her mind, and the once brilliant student found herself struggling to string sentences together. The silent witness here wasn't just the missing cup or the shampoo bottle, it was Zhu Ling's own biology. Later, forensic experts like Chen Zhenyang would look at the strands of her hair under a microscope and see the history written in chemical peaks. They would see two distinct spikes of thallium exposure. The first was a warning. The second was a death sentence. By mid-March, the girl who could master complex chemical equations and ancient melodies was losing her grip on reality. On March 20th, the light went out. Zhu Ling fell into a deep, hollow coma. As she lay in a hospital bed, her breathing maintained by a machine. Her central nervous system was being systematically dismantled by a heavy metal that shouldn't have been anywhere near a dormitory. While the doctors stood by, helpless and confused, a small group of her friends decided to do something radical. They turned to a technology that was almost mythical in 1995 China, the Internet. They sent out a digital SOS to the world, a message in a bottle cast into the electronic sea. And when the replies started coming back from doctors in the US and Europe, they all said the same thing. They all pointed to a single, terrifying word that the Beijing hospital had refused to even consider. A word that changed everything. Thallium. It's a word that sounds clinical, almost ethereal, but in the world of toxicology, it is the stuff of nightmares. Known as the poisoner's poison, thallium is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. It is a ghost that slips into the body, mimicking essential minerals like potassium, tricking the cells into letting it in, only to systematically dismantle the central nervous system from the inside out. It doesn't just kill, it deconstructs a human being. For the doctors at the prestigious Peking Union Medical College Hospital, this diagnosis was more than a shock, it was an insult. They were the medical elite of China, and here were a group of college kids, led by Zhu Ling's friend Bai Zhicheng, claiming that strangers on a digital bulletin board knew more than they did. The doctors scoffed at the Internet, a technology they viewed as a playground for hobbyists, not a source of medical truth. They clung to their diagnosis of Guillain-Barré syndrome, even as Zhu Ling's body continued to wither under the weight of an invisible predator. But the numbers didn't lie. By mid-April 1995, over 1,500 emails had poured in from across the globe. It was perhaps the first time in history that the collective intelligence of the world was harnessed to save a single life. Experts from UCLA, Cambridge, and the University of Toronto were all screaming the same thing through their cathode ray monitors. Test for heavy metals. Specifically, test for thallium. On April 28, 1995, a sample of Zhu Ling's hair, nails, and blood finally reached the desk of Professor Chen Zhenyang at the Beijing Institute of Occupational Protection. He didn't need a sophisticated computer to see the truth. The results were staggering. The concentration of thallium in Zhu Ling's system wasn't just high, it was thousands of times above the lethal limit. It was a level of toxicity that shouldn't have been possible for a student who spent her days in a music hall and a university laboratory. And there was a more chilling revelation hidden in the forensic data. This wasn't a single, tragic accident. The spikes in the toxin levels across the segments of her hair suggested multiple exposures. Someone had been feeding her this poison bit by bit, over the course of several months. It was a slow-motion execution. The antidote arrived on May 3rd, and it was as strange as the crime itself: Prussian blue. A common industrial pigment used in paint and ink. In a twist of medical irony, this deep blue dye acts as a molecular magnet, binding to thallium in the gut and dragging it out of the body before it can be reabsorbed. Within days of receiving the pigment, the poison finally began to recede. But the victory was hollow. The ghost had already burned through her neurons, leaving her trapped in a body that no longer obeyed her. As the medical fog cleared, a darker shadow fell over Tsinghua University. On May 7, the Beijing Municipal Public Security Bureau officially opened a criminal investigation. They turned their eyes toward the place Zhu Ling called Home Building 6, Room 114. But when investigators arrived to gather the silent witnesses, the everyday objects that might hold a microscopic trace of the toxin, they found something that turned their blood cold. In the chaos of the hospitalizations, while Zhu Ling was fighting for every breath, her dorm room had been cleaned. It wasn't a routine tidying. Someone had been surgical. Her stainless steel cup gone. Her contact lens case missing. Her toothbrush and a specific bottle of shampoo vanished. Out of all the belongings in that crowded room, only the items that would have been the most direct delivery systems for a tasteless poison were gone. The crime scene hadn't just been neglected, it had been scrubbed. And as the police looked at the 3 other girls who shared that small, cramped space, they realized the predator wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows of the campus. The predator had been sleeping only a few feet away from Zhu Ling's bed, watching her suffer, and waiting for the perfect moment to erase the evidence. The realization that the threat came from within the dormitory walls changed everything. In the high-pressure cooker of Tsinghua University, where the brightest minds in China were forged, a darker chemistry was at play. When the Beijing Municipal Public Security Bureau finally opened a criminal case on May 7, 1995, they weren't looking for a shadowy intruder. They were looking at the girls who had shared Zhu Ling's life for 3 years. Investigators soon focused their gaze on a single name, Sun Y. She wasn't just another student, she was a member of the same chemistry research group and a fellow musician in the university orchestra. More importantly, she was the only student in that inner circle who had authorized access to thallium in the university's laboratory. In a world of strict protocols and locked cabinets, Sun Y held the literal and figurative key to the poison that was liquefying her roommate's nervous system. But the physical evidence was cold. The missing items, the cup, the lens case, the shampoo, were gone. This wasn't a random theft, it was a surgical removal of the smoking guns. Yet, forensic science had a way of speaking when the witnesses remained silent. Professor Chen Jinying, at the Beijing Institute of Occupational Protection, wasn't just looking at the poison, he was looking at the timing. Using hair analysis, experts began to piece together a map of the crime. Think of a human hair like a cassette tape, recording everything the body absorbs. As Zhu Ling's hair grew, it trapped the thallium in its structure. By measuring the concentration at different points along the shaft, scientists could tell exactly when she was poisoned. The results were chilling. This wasn't a one-time accident. It was a sustained, 2-stage assault. The first peaks appeared in late 1994, corresponding with her initial hair loss and stomach pain. But the second wave, the one that hit in March 1995, was a tidal wave of toxicity. The levels in her nails were staggering, reaching over 22,000 micrograms per kilogram. It was a lethal dose, administered slowly, drop by drop, likely into the very things that were now missing from her bedside table. Imagine the psychology required to execute such a plan. To sit across from someone as they lose their hair, as they scream in pain, as they lose their sight, and then to offer them another cup of water laced with the very thing that is killing them. It suggests a level of clinical detachment that borders on the sociopathic. Was it a rivalry over a solo in the orchestra? Was it the crushing weight of academic competition in a culture that demanded nothing less than perfection? Or was it something more visceral, a personal grudge fueled by the proximity of 2 brilliant young women who simply couldn't coexist in the same small space? By April 1997, nearly 2 years after the investigation began, the police finally brought Sun Y in for an 8-hour interrogation. The pressure was mounting. The public was watching. But as the detectives sat across from the young woman with the powerful family lineage, they realized they weren't just fighting a killer. They were fighting a legacy. Sun Y's grandfather was a man of immense political influence, a titan of the old guard. And as the clock ticked toward the end of that 8-hour session, the air in the interrogation room didn't just feel heavy, it felt like a vacuum. Because in a system where who you know is often more important than what you've done, the truth was beginning to suffocate under the weight of a name. Just as the police thought they were closing in, the orders came down from the highest levels of the state. The investigation was to be frozen. Of immense political influence, a titan of the old guard. And as the clock ticked toward the end of that 8-hour session, the air in the interrogation room didn't just feel heavy, it felt like a vacuum. Because in a system where who you know is often more important than what you've done, the truth was beginning to suffocate under the weight of a name. Just as the police thought they were closing in, the orders came down from the highest levels of the state. The investigation was to be frozen. The detectives, seasoned men who had navigated the darkest alleys of Beijing, suddenly found themselves staring at a case file that had become radioactive. Sun Wei didn't leave that room in handcuffs. She walked out into the crisp morning air, shielded by a lineage that reached into the very heart of power. Her grandfather, Sun Yuiki, was a man whose shadow loomed over the history of the nation. In the eyes of the law, she was a suspect. In the eyes of the elite, she was untouchable. And so, the machinery of justice simply stopped. The gears ground to a halt, leaving the truth trapped in the silence of a closed door. But while the paper trail was being severed, the silent witnesses, the physical objects that populated Zhu Ling's world, remained. In true crime, we often look for the smoking gun, but in the sterile dorm rooms of Tsinghua University, the weapons were far more intimate. Room 223 should have been a crime scene preserved in amber, a time capsule of the moment the poison took hold. Yet, a chilling anomaly occurred. During the window between Zhu Ling falling into a coma and the official confirmation of thallium poisoning, a theft took place in the dormitory. It wasn't a typical burglary. The intruder didn't want electronics or cash. They bypassed valuables to snatch the mundane: a stainless steel cup, a contact lens case, and a bottle of shampoo. These were the artifacts of a girl's daily routine. To a casual observer, it looked like a prank or a strange coincidence. To a forensic profiler, it was a surgical strike. This was forensic awareness, the calculated act of a perpetrator scrubbing the world of their presence. By stealing the cup and the toiletries, the killer wasn't just taking property, they were destroying the evidence of how the toxin was delivered. They were erasing the fingerprints of a crime that was still in progress. Despite the missing evidence, the science told a story that politics couldn't censor. Professor Chen Zhenyang's toxicological analysis of Zhu Ling's hair functioned like a biological ledger of cruelty. Using advanced testing, he discovered that the thallium hadn't been administered in one massive dose. Instead, the levels spiked in waves. This was a sustained, rhythmic assault. It meant the killer sat across from Zhu Ling day after day, watching her vibrant life wither. They watched her hair fall out in clumps, heard her cries of agony as her nerves burned, and then with a steady hand they reached for the bottle and did it again. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a slow-motion execution. The motive lived in the suffocating pressure of Tsinghua's academic halls. In this high-stakes environment, every grade is a battle, and every musical solo in the orchestra is a throne to be defended. Zhu Ling was the sun that everyone revolved around, talented, beautiful, and effortless. Sun Wei was the girl in the shadows, the roommate who shared the same lab, the same orchestra, and the same air. The resentment didn't explode, it fermented. It was a cold, calculated envy that decided if it couldn't share the light, it would extinguish it. But just as the investigation was being buried, a ghost began to stir. A decade after the files were locked away, a hidden detail from the university's chemistry lab logbooks was leaked to a few determined eyes. It was a record that shouldn't have existed, a signature on a request for thallium that had been overlooked for years. And it suggested that the only person with access wasn't just a theory, it was a documented fact that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. This wasn't just a cold case anymore, it was a cover-up with a pulse. This wasn't just a cold case anymore, it was a cover-up with a pulse. Imagine the atmosphere of a top-tier university lab in the mid-90s, a cathedral of science, sterile and sharp, where logic is supposed to reign supreme. At Tsinghua, the chemistry department was the crown jewel, but its backrooms held secrets that defied every law of transparency. That leaked signature in the logbook was more than just ink on a page, it was a smoking gun with a thermal signature. It confirmed that Sun Wei hadn't just been in the vicinity of the poison, she had checked it out. The records showed she was working on a research project specifically involving thallium nitrate, a substance so lethal that a dose no larger than a grain of salt can systematically dismantle a human nervous system. Yet, when the police first began their inquiries, the university's narrative was a collective, institutional shrug. But the silent witnesses left behind in room 114 of Building 6 told a much darker story. When Zhu Ling was first rushed to the hospital, her dorm room wasn't cordoned off. It wasn't treated like the crime scene it clearly was. Then, in a move that felt like a surgical strike, the impossible happened. Zhu Ling's most personal items, her ceramic coffee mug, her contact lens case, and even her specific brand of shampoo simply vanished. They weren't stolen by a common thief looking for electronics or cash. They were purged. In the world of forensic profiling, we call this consciousness of guilt. A perpetrator doesn't take a victim's toothbrush for its value, they take it because it's a biohazard holding the evidence of their method. Someone knew exactly what the doctors would eventually look for, even before the medical team at Peking Union Medical College had a clue. It takes a chilling level of psychological detachment to walk into the room of a friend who is currently fighting for her life in a coma and methodically scrub away the tools of her destruction. It wasn't an act of impulse, it was a forensic cleanup. As the years groaned on, the science finally caught up to the shadows. When forensic experts later utilized LAICPMS, a high-tech laser ablation technique, to analyze a single strand of Zhu Ling's hair, they didn't just find poison. They found a diary of her murder attempt. The laser mapped the thallium concentration along the hair shaft like a tree ring, revealing a jagged mountain range of agony. It wasn't one single dose. The spikes in toxicity aligned perfectly with the calendar of the semester. There were periods of low-level seeding, where she was being weakened, followed by massive, crushing blows intended to be terminal. It was a slow-motion execution carried out in the middle of a crowded dormitory. By April 2, 1997, the weight of this evidence finally forced the hand of the Beijing Public Security Bureau. They brought Sun Wai in for an 8-hour interrogation. This was supposed to be the moment the dam broke. Most suspects, when confronted with the reality of hair analysis mapping and the missing logbook signatures, begin to unravel. But Sun Wai possessed a pedigree that functioned like an invisible suit of armor. Her grandfather, Sun Yueki, was a titan of the old guard, a man whose political roots were so deep they were intertwined with the very foundation of the state. For 8 hours, the investigators pushed, but they were hitting a brick wall made of ironclad privilege. Sun Wai didn't just provide answers. She provided deflections that felt rehearsed, backed by a confidence that only comes from knowing the game is rigged in your favor. As the sun set over the city that evening, the lead investigator realized they weren't just chasing a killer in a lab coat. They were staring into the eyes of someone who knew that in this world, some people are simply too powerful to be handcuffed. The interrogation didn't end with a confession. It ended with a phone call that would effectively bury the case for the next 25 years, leaving a father and mother to watch their daughter wither away in a silent, waking grave. But even the deepest graves have a way of exhaling the truth when the wind shifts. Realized they weren't just chasing a killer in a lab coat. They were staring into the eyes of someone who knew that in this world, some people are simply too powerful to be handcuffed. The interrogation didn't end with a confession. It ended with a phone call that would effectively bury the case for the next 25 years, leaving a father and mother to watch their daughter wither away in a silent, waking grave. But even the deepest graves have a way of exhaling the truth when the wind shifts. The silence that followed August 1998 wasn't an accident. It was a masterpiece of political engineering. When the Beijing Municipal Public Security Bureau effectively shuttered the file, they didn't just close a folder, they sealed a vacuum. But inside that vacuum, the evidence began to speak a language that only time and technology could translate. While the primary suspect eventually moved on, changing her name, relocating, and attempting to dissolve into the anonymity of a new life, the forensic trail remained frozen in the most intimate of places, Zhu Ling's own body. Years after the investigation hit a state-mandated wall, advanced testing, specifically laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, was applied to a single, preserved strand of Zhu Ling's hair. This wasn't just science, it was a biological black box flight recorder. The results were a visceral punch to the gut. The thallium concentrations weren't a single spike indicative of an accidental spill. Instead, they formed a horrifying barcode of intent. The hair revealed at least 2 massive exposure events, punctuated by smaller, chronic doses. It was a rhythmic, sustained campaign of cruelty. It showed that as Zhu Ling fought to recover in late 1994, someone was already measuring out the next dose that would finish the job in 1995. But as the science grew sharper, the physical evidence at the scene had long since undergone a forensic lobotomy. Shortly after the thallium diagnosis was confirmed, a burglary occurred in Zhu Ling's dormitory room. It was a surgical strike. The thieves ignored money and valuables. They took her coffee cup. They took her contact lens case. They took her bottle of shampoo. These were the silent witnesses, the delivery systems that could have proven exactly how the toxin entered her body. By the time the police officially secured the room, the smoking gun had been scrubbed and discarded, likely buried in a Beijing landfill. This calculated destruction points to a perpetrator with more than just a passing knowledge of chemistry. It suggests a killer who was forensic aware, someone who understood that the bridge between suspect and convict is built on trace evidence. The profile shifted from a jealous peer to a cold-blooded tactician. Sun Y, the only student with documented access to the restricted heavy metal, remained the sun around which all suspicion orbited. She was the roommate who watched Zhu Ling's hair fall out in clumps. She was the one who listened to the screams of needle prick pain and then sat across from her the next morning, perhaps wondering why she was still breathing. For the next 2 decades, Zhu Ling's parents, Ling Zhendao and Zhu Mingxin, lived in a high-rise purgatory. They spent their retirement years changing the diapers of a woman who was once a chemical engineering prodigy. They watched their daughter's brain atrophy, her optic nerves wither, and her body become a twisted cage of failed motor functions. They lived in the shadow of a system that had traded their daughter's justice for a family's political standing. But the 21st century brought a weapon that the invisible hands of the 90s hadn't prepared for the digital memory. In the early 2000s, the case didn't just resurface, it ignited. An online community of amateur sleuths and indignant citizens began to piece together the fragments of the 1997 interrogation. They began to track the suspect's movements across the globe. And they discovered that while the law had been silenced, the internet had a very long, very loud memory. The hunt for justice was no longer confined to a dusty precinct in Beijing. It was about to go global, fueled by a revelation that would turn a cold case into a digital manhunt. The digital age didn't just provide a platform for this cold case, it provided a permanent, unerasable record. By 2013, the simmering resentment in China over the perceived injustice of the Tsinghua poisoning boiled over, leaping across the Pacific and landing squarely on the doorstep of the White House. An online petition on the We the People platform garnered over 140,000 signatures in a matter of days, demanding the U.S. government investigate and deport the primary suspect. The internet had done what the Beijing police could not, or would not, do. They tracked the ghost. They found her under a new identity, Jasmine Sun, living a life of quiet suburban anonymity in the United States. While Zhu Ling's world had shrunk to the 4 walls of a specialized care facility, her body a gnarled wreckage of its former brilliance, Sun Y had purportedly built a career, a family, and a future. To the amateur sleuths, this wasn't just a change of scenery. It was a calculated evasion of the shadow cast by a dying woman. The contrast was a jagged pill to swallow. On one side, a musical prodigy who required 24-hour suctioning of her lungs and whose parents had aged decades in a few short years. On the other, a suspect who had vanished into the American dream, protected by the very borders she had crossed. But the digital manhunt was only one front of this war. In laboratories far removed from the noise of social media, science was beginning to speak for Zhu Ling in ways she never could. In 2018, a new forensic analysis of her hair samples preserved like biological time capsules from 1994 and 1995 was conducted using laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. This wasn't the crude testing of the 90s. This was a molecular interrogation. The results were chilling. The analysis revealed that Zhu Ling hadn't just been poisoned once or twice. The thallium spikes in her hair acted like a barcode of attempted murder, showing multiple, distinct ingestion events over several months. It painted a picture of a predator who was patient, someone who watched her suffer, watched her hair fall out, watched her struggle to walk, and then, with terrifying coldness, reached for the bottle again. The data suggested the poisoning intensified after she returned to school for the 2nd semester, a period when the circle of those with access to her daily routine was at its smallest. This was no longer a case of a tragic accident or a one-off moment of clouded judgment. It was a prolonged, methodical execution. The forensic profile of the perpetrator shifted from a jealous peer to something much more sinister, a forensic-aware individual who understood the delayed onset of thallium symptoms, using the gap between ingestion and illness to create an alibi. The silent witnesses, the missing cup, the vanished toothbrush, the stolen contact lens case weren't just petty thefts. They were a scorched earth policy, a deliberate scrubbing of the crime scene that only someone living within the same 4 walls could have orchestrated. Yet, as the evidence mounted in the court of public opinion and the annals of science, the wall of political silence remained impenetrable. the suspect's grandfather, Sun Yueki, was a man whose influence reached into the very marrow of the state. He was a revolutionary veteran, a figure whose proximity to power was whispered to be the ultimate shield for his granddaughter. The investigation didn't just hit a dead end, it hit a vault door. As the years bled into decades, the question shifted from who did it to why were they allowed to get away with it. But just as the world began to accept that the truth might die with Zhu Ling, a new, even more disturbing detail emerged from the shadows of the 1997 interrogation transcripts, a detail that didn't just point to a killer, but suggested that the most crucial piece of evidence wasn't missing at all. It had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closer at the one place the police had been forbidden to search. Shifted from who did it to why were they allowed to get away with it. But just as the world began to accept that the truth might die with Zhu Ling, a new, even more disturbing detail emerged from the shadows of the 1997 interrogation transcripts, a detail that didn't just point to a killer, but suggested that the most crucial piece of evidence wasn't missing at all. It had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closer at the one place the police had been forbidden to search. The transcripts from that April afternoon in 1997 paint a picture of a psychological chess match. For 8 hours, Sun Wai sat across from investigators, the weight of her family's political legacy acting as an invisible shield around her. While the police pressed her on her access to the chemistry lab, the real story was being told by the silent witnesses, the objects that had vanished from room 228. Forensic analysis later suggested that the poisoning of Zhu Ling wasn't a single, impulsive act. It was a rhythmic, calculated dosing. Using laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry on preserved hair samples, experts identified at least 2 distinct peaks of exposure. The first was a warning shot, the second was the killing blow. This wasn't a mistake. It was a chemical execution. The toxin of choice thallium is known in the underworld as the inheritor's powder, tasteless, odorless, and perfectly patient. It mimics potassium, slipping past the body's defenses like a Trojan horse, systematically dismantling the nervous system from the inside out. The missing items, Zhu Ling's stainless steel cup, her contact lens case, and her shampoo bottle, weren't just random thefts. In a dorm where nothing else of value was taken, these items were forensic gold mines. Their disappearance immediately after the diagnosis was a neon sign pointing toward someone with internal knowledge, someone who knew that the thallium hadn't just been ingested, but had likely been applied to things Zhu Ling touched every single day. By 1998, the case had hit a wall made of red tape and high-level influence. The Beijing Municipal Public Security Bureau effectively shuttered the file, citing a lack of evidence. But to those who knew the mechanics of power in the capital, the message was clear: some suspects are too heavy for the scales of justice to hold. Sun Wai eventually moved abroad, changing her name and her life, seeking the anonymity that her victim was never afforded. Zhu Ling spent the next 30 years as a ghost in her own body. The vibrant musician who once played the moonlight on the Spring River was reduced to a state of near total paralysis, her brain suffering from massive atrophy, her vision gone, her once brilliant mind trapped behind a veil of neurological scarring. She became a living monument to a crime without a conviction. When Zhu Ling finally passed away on December 22, 2023, at the age of 50, she took the final secrets of that 1994 dorm room with her. But as the case files grow yellow and the ink fades, one haunting reality remains. The evidence wasn't lost because of a botched investigation or a clever criminal. It was lost because the system decided that the truth was more dangerous than the lie. The tragedy of Zhu Ling isn't just that she died. It's that her killer didn't have to hide in the shadows. They simply waited for the world to stop looking. And as the case remains in a permanent state of legal purgatory, we are left with the most terrifying thought of all: the person who knows exactly how those thallium crystals felt as they dissolved into a morning cup of tea is still out there, breathing the same air you are, perhaps even standing in line behind you, wearing the same polite, unassuming smile of a college roommate who never quite got caught.